Welcome to the Recovery Stories podcast, bringing you stories of hope, healing, and triumph over the bondage of addictions, mental health struggles, trauma, and dysfunctional family systems. Our courageous storytellers have chosen to live their journey out loud in order to show others that they don't have to suffer in silence. The stories you will hear are raw, real, and may involve graphic and triggering content. This podcast is brought to you by Promises Behavioral Health's Rooted alumni community. If you or a loved one are struggling, have questions, or are ready to take the next step, call our admission center at 888-648-4098 or visit us online at www.promisesbehavioralhealth.com. Our team is ready and waiting to answer the call for help.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of Rooted Recovery Stories. My name is Patrick Custer and I'm your host, and we are so glad that you're here for this episode. Pleased to introduce our guest today, Andrew Chapman, who is not only a trauma therapist in Nashville, Tennessee, but also the co-director of Wildheart Meditation Center and a fellow recovering person here to tell his story. Thanks for being on here today, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me out.
Awesome. Well, with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. I'm really excited to hear your story.
Sure. Yeah. So starting in the beginning, it's interesting because I work with people today, and when I ask them to start at the beginning, a lot of times those memories are pretty fuzzy and also seem insignificant because we're so much older now. But if I really look at like how it felt to be a kid growing up in my family and Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is where I was initially raised, I just remember all of my memories actually pre-10 years old. I was alone and the world feels really big, and so I've kind of deduced from that either I was a really sensitive person, sensitive of my environment, feeling like the world was something much bigger than I was, or maybe I was a scared kid. I don't think my parents were going through a lot during that time of our life, and I don't think that they were around or maybe equipped to, be present with me and my sister. So all of those things together, I think, just kind of combined in a general sense of feeling fear from a really young age. My mom even talks about when we moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, her and I driving in the car, and I asked her all these adult questions of how will I know how to balance my checkbook, right? Or how will I know, when I get a job, how to pay my car payment? All of these really adult questions. I was probably 9 years old.
Wow.
And so I just always remember anticipating responsibility, feeling like I couldn't crack it, maybe a sense of incompetence or inadequacy, other people had things figured out more than I did. I felt kind of lost in the world, to use a Frozen reference, or lost in the woods. But so that was, my early childhood. And other than that, I had loving parents. My dad worked a lot. My mom always held down a part-time job. It was me and my sister. I had some good friendships. We moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee when I was 7. And that kicked off kind of a next chapter. And this is cool to go back and do my own work now, my own therapy work, because when I am trying to get access to a memory that's really young, that move is kind of a timeline indicator. So Chattanooga, Tennessee, things were all right. It was kind of an adjustment. I wasn't used to living in as religious of a culture. My parents didn't really raise us with any religion. My mom was Catholic because her family's Ukrainian, and that's kind of that's just what you do. You drop your kids off, to go to church on Sunday is basically a place to have daycare, and your parents may or may not go. So there's kind of that vibe. I remember that being interesting. And my whole life I felt kind of out of place in my family. I've always been kind of the comedian in the family, always into alternative things, always playing the devil's advocate. That's kind of just the sense that I get about moving to Chattanooga is moving into the suburbs at first and just not really quite feeling like I fit in anywhere. So I'll fast forward a little bit to kind of what happened, right? That maybe was the impetus for my addiction. I know that there are probably genetic factors. My mom's family are all heavy drinkers. My dad's dad is a pretty heavy drinker. My dad is himself. But I would say, other than the genetic factors, what kind of happened to me that launched me into addiction is I found out when I was maybe 13 that my mom had been having an affair. And so we moved out of my house into two separate houses. My parents did tell me about it, but now in hindsight, looking at it, I think my dad forced my mom to tell us about it because he felt betrayed. And I think he wanted us to, feel betrayed by our mom as well. Like, to not necessarily to be on his side, but to feel the hurt that he felt. And in retrospect, that wasn't probably the best way to go about it because, our family just kind of split, a bunch of weird mixed feelings. My dad worked a lot his entire life, so it was just natural that we stayed with my mom more. Yeah. And then I started a new school. It's an all-boys school in Chattanooga that I'd asked my parents that I wanted to go to. And the vibe there was just macho, being young men, playing athletics, really intense academic world. So it was just like going from public school, being a kid, basically a middle schooler, to going into the 7th grade, which is still middle school, but feeling like I'm going to college. And and so that happened. And then I instantly started getting in fights with people at school. The 8th graders, between 7th and 8th grade, you're hitting puberty. So it's like the 8th graders are like men and the 7th graders like little boys still. And, I've always been really sensitive and never liked authority. I always felt like I was saying, that just kind of adults weirded me out a little bit. Like, did they really know what was going on? And who could I trust? A lot of just weird things. I'd gone to church once I went to Chattanooga and just didn't feel like I vibed with the kind of authoritarian approach. So all of that stuff. Yeah.
Do you feel like the trust thing started for you after, did you say that was when you were 13 that the split happened and your dad kind of the divide was taking place?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a big part of it. I think it's a combination of that. It's a combination of like a heavily religious culture, like going to an all boys school where it was all about like sports and being macho, like all of those things. Like none of those things I could really trust. It's like it wasn't me. It wasn't my fault that my mom had an affair. I don't really relate to the athletic focus or the heavily academic focus, all of those things. So I started to question of like, what is this? Not happy, staying up late at night. I remember watching Howard Stern. The only reason I remember that is because that was like the midnight or 1 o'clock hour. So I'd stay up late, anxiety, depression, but you don't know that when you're a kid. You just feel off, and so that started, and I was getting in fights with kids at school, physical fights. And I remember, this is another part of the trust piece, going to the principal's office and just like having gotten in a physical fight with 3 8th graders. It's just me and them 3, and they trapped me behind this door and were like kicking me and punching me. We went to the principal's office, and the principal was like, Andrew, you just shouldn't walk down their hallway anymore. And that was the solution, right? It wasn't like to punish them or he didn't even acknowledge them or their part in it. And it was 3-on-1. So at that point, right, like this other part of me started coming out, which is, obviously these people aren't going to take care of me. Obviously people can't be trusted to like hold up their end of the bargain. That was the biggest thing that I had learned through that experience. That's what I would say my trauma is this betrayal wound. And I was like, so fuck it. I'm gonna do things my way. And at that point, I almost instantly started hanging out with a group of seventh graders that had older siblings that would use drugs. From the time I was about 13, 14, I started smoking weed. And within 3 months, I was using psychedelics. I had used coke a couple months later. And then by the time I was 16, I was using crack cocaine and methamphetamine, amongst other things. And so I just hit it pretty heavy, you know.
Have you ever thought about and ask yourself, like, do you think it was chaos that you were seeking because of mistrust and just saying, well, nothing matters? Or do you think it was because it was control, because when you took a substance, you knew how you were going to feel when you would take that substance? And so when all this other stuff that you couldn't control was clearly out of your control, this was the one thing that you could.
Yeah.
Did you ever ask yourself that?
It's a great question, right? I mean, that is kind of the question when we're looking at like what leads to addiction, alcoholism. Like, what are we seeking? Is it that feeling that we can let go into the chaos and find relief through that, or try to control? And I think for me it's a little bit of both, but I would say in general, it was to control the way that I felt. I could use a substance and be a part of something. I think the most important thing for using about me was the social component. Like, I felt like, yeah, it was taboo, it was wrong, it was raw, but it was like, we could, skip school and go to this place we called the Bamboo Forest and smoke a bowl. And like, there was a group of 5 or 6 people, and it was that kind of like camaraderie of, we're doing something we shouldn't be doing, but we're all in it together. We're all going to take the fall. There was something about taking back that power of choice, from authority that said, go to school and don't walk down the 8th grade hallway, and go to church and go live with your mom. And I was like, fuck it. I'm going to go to the Bamboo Forest and get high. And I've got a group of people that will rebel with me. So I think it was a lot about controlling, having control, feeling empowered to make my own choice. I think a lot of it was that.
Okay. Makes sense. I mean, any of the answers would have made sense.
Yeah.
I mean, because we all,
Right. At the end of the day, it's like, just, right. It's those chemicals in our brain that we seek in everything. So it just makes sense that we want to feel different than how we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So you found this new way, like we do, and you find connection with your friends, and like you said, a sense of solidarity. And how did that progress for you? Did you start experiencing consequences immediately? What happened next?
So interestingly, after you answer that or ask that question about, is it about control or chaos? What happened for me is I started selling drugs, and it became almost more important to me than using drugs. And I would, from a very young age, I started selling at 15 or 16. 16 is when it really took off. I would connect with the head drug dealers in Chattanooga. These guys were, because all of them were guys, they were probably in their late 20s. And I was a 16-year-old kid,
Wow.
And I would buy pounds of weed, ounces of coke, high quantities of drugs for a kid. And I would sell them to all the kids at the schools. And I became very calculated about it, and money became kind of my pathway to independence and autonomy. So I think this is the theme for me, is like, drugs somehow gave me the feeling of having a way out, whether it was a way of out of how I felt, or whether it was a way out financially by being independent, not having to rely on people. It was just a way out. It was an escape in the purest form of that. So that's what progressed for me. I started selling and using, and when I would use anything that was there, and I would find people that would use harder drugs with me, and we would go off in pairs. There was a little bit of like a sense of shame around using crack cocaine and methamphetamine. Like, these weren't socially acceptable drugs. but it felt like a deeper layer. Like, it's kind of like addiction is like the dark arts, like once you
Right.
go, like there are layers to it. And there was something very enticing about how wrong it was. And it wasn't even that I actually liked smoking crack or meth. It was just like another level of society that was just felt like it made you alive. And I think that was that bit of chaos. It was
Chaos.
like, yeah, I mean, it's just like anything could happen. I mean, I'm around some wild people. I mean, picking up my drug dealer, he's got a gun on his hip and he got the house arrest bracelet on his ankle, and he's saying, all right, I've got 30 minutes and we got to go by my daughter's school so they think that I'm picking her up, or can we go pick up my daughter? I had to go help my drug dealer pick up his daughter so I could get dope. And there's something about living in that world that's just like, yeah, it made you feel really alive, because I think in some ways makes you feel like anything could happen at any time. You could die, something could go wrong. Yeah.
Well, a thought that comes to mind that makes so much sense to me is, if you're raised in a world where, especially in your teen years and things are changing, that you lose, instead of gaining trust in authority figures and what have you, whether it's your parents, so clearly that was broken, your school system, that's you're placed in the South, you don't really trust, so trust isn't there. It makes so much sense that, when it comes to societal norms, I mean, what teens really are, it's funny because in some ways, a lot of teens want to conform to societal norms, but in so many ways, rebelling is the answer. Right. But it, especially when you explain, that, your early years and the issues with trust, it makes so much sense that what would make you feel like you were thriving is this you've got the camaraderie and it's y'all against the world. Yeah. And it's clearly it's good and it's right because you've been told you can't trust the world. Right.
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head, and I've thought about that a lot. I'm glad you brought it up here, is that I was also a teenager, right? And so in some ways I was doing really typically what other teenagers did. And I flocked towards those other teenagers that were rebelling against their parents just with using drugs. So it was like, it wasn't that, I mean, my behavior became extreme by society standards, but there were a group of people that were doing that, and so it was on par for just being a teenager and rebelling, but it was also the mixture of that alongside a lot of broken trust that all transpired over the course of a year that set up that kind of like, and probably the genetic predisposition to be an addict. All of those three things are like the worst ingredients, developmental stage, attachment wound, like betrayal, and genetics. And you put those three together and you get a full blown addict by the time I'm 15 or 16, know?
Yeah. That makes so much sense. So what happened next? Because I mean, you've got your tribe, and you're going forward. Were you making it in school? Was what was going on? Again, I'm like, where had the consequences started to roll in yet, or what's taking place?
So I was pretty smart about really tending to the relationships of people that I was using with. So I would be really kind and really fair and really just. I wasn't a really seedy drug dealer. So I would stay pretty low key. I wasn't out there hustling like someone that's selling dope on the corner, like outside just to whoever. I would keep the network close and I'd be really kind and fair. And so I could kind of build up that feeling of security in that community. And I realized that a lot of the adults in my life, whether it's school or with my parents, and really in a lot of ways I have so much empathy for my parents, and that's another side of the story. Of course I don't really want to paint them to be the worst parents ever. I made a lot of peace with that. I made a lot of amends and practiced a lot of forgiveness with that, because I did a lot of horrible shit when I was an addict as well. But
Yeah.
you know, I realized that a lot of the adults in my life, they were looking for me to appear successful. So long as I was making good grades and going to school and doing the things that I said I was going to do, I wouldn't get in trouble. You know, there wouldn't be any punishment. So I made straight A's. I kept up with all of that external stuff, and I didn't have any extracurriculars or whatever. So I played music, actually. So I would tell my parents I'm going to play music at someone's house and would get high and spend the night there. And so that was kind of my sophomore, junior, senior year. And I had a blast. You know, that's the hard thing that we don't talk a lot about with addiction, is that, you know, there's a lot of fun to be had when you're living that freely, right? Like, there is something that's true about that. You're kind of living outside of the parameters when you're taking psychedelic drugs and doing some of these things.
Yeah.
And some of those experiences were really great and life-changing. But the problem with addiction is that it becomes unmanageable.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest part, is because there are these times when it's working so well and you're feeling so good, but the spiral, right, the trajectory of what happens over time is it gets out of control. And once you cross, I actually believe for a lot of people, you cross a threshold.
Yeah.
I believe that a switch gets kind of flipped at some point. And for me, just in my belief for myself, once you flip that switch, there's no going back. It's abstinence or it's addiction. And that's how I see it. You know, and I know some people that have been in 12-step recovery and gotten clean, and then they can drink and whatever. I guarantee you that's not me. I guarantee you that's not me, because there's something in here. You know, there's something in here that once it gets switched, you know, that part of me, the addict part of me, just is still living. And so, long story short, everything on the outside was going good. My addiction was getting worse, getting unmanageable. The fun times were still fun, but I started having to drink all the time. I had gotten in trouble at school. I failed a hair test for MDMA. I almost got kicked out, but my grades were really good, so they wanted to let me finish. I got through school. I got caught by my parents with a bunch of dope that I'd been selling in like $5 or $6 grand in cash right before I was supposed to go to college. So they kept me home. They sent me to my first treatment, outpatient treatment. I talked the counselor out of saying that I was an addict and said, oh, I was just had a problem selling. And my parents said, well, you don't have to go then. And I had to get drug tested. And so I started drinking every day. And I'd start drinking at like 11 in the morning, 11 or 12. And that lasted for a couple months. And basically I had a drug dealer partnership, 2 guys that would sell me drugs, come to my house, and they fronted me like 200, 300 Xanax bars. And I went out to sell them. I took 6 or 7 of them. I blacked out. The cops were called on me, and I was arrested at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. They still have a restraining order against me for the rest of my life. And so I was looking at basically 3 felonies, one for the trespassing, like selling drugs in a school zone. That was my biggest one. One for the distribution with intent to sell, and or a possession charge, and then one with felony for a fake driver's license that I had, and went to jail. And you know, everything kind of came crashing down. Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers in that time of my life. I won't go into all the stories, but that's basically what happened. And
how old were you at this point?
I was 18.
Okay. So had you graduated high school yet?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you in college in between?
So I had gotten pulled from Appalachian State, where I wanted to go. in Boone, North Carolina, and I was going to Chattanooga State Community College, taking a couple classes for that semester.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I basically met with my attorney, and he had said, it's very, very likely that you're going to get 6 months in like a young adult prison camp kind of situation where like you're not locked down, but you're like out doing work labor. It's like boot camp basically. And he said my sentence was 1129 in prison. So the sentencing I should have gotten was about a year in prison, but he said, I can probably get it reduced to 6 months in one of these young adult camps if you go to rehab. And I just put that off. My half sister called me. I was still using. She asked if I wanted help. Every bone in my body said no, but I said yes out loud. I have no clue still to this day where that came from. I remember instantly regretting it when I said yes. And so that was the thing that set the ball in motion for me to go to treatment. My attorney had told me, and then my sister asked if I needed help. I'd said yes, and then everything kind of came together, and I went to Cumberland Heights here in Nashville.
That's awesome. So what was treatment like for you, and were you able to stay sober afterwards?
Yeah, so I was super sick, but in denial. I mean, crazy, man. Like people that I used with, there's always people that are worse than you. That's the thing. Like the addict is never you. And I mean, there's a guy that I've not a client, just a guy that I know recently that his life is just in the shitter. I mean, it's bad. It's bad. And he's like, I'm not an alcoholic. And I'm like, dude, like what more evidence do you need? You know what I mean? But like, that's from where I'm sitting. But when you're in that mentality, that's where I was at when I went to treatment. I was just like, man, like I'm not that bad. There are tons of people that fiend over drugs and alcohol, and I don't really fiend, and that was my story.
Yeah.
But I was sick, and I got to treatment, and I got put on detox meds. And about 4 or 5 days into treatment, I went and did a psychodrama therapy group. And my blood pressure, my bottom number got up to like 116. I was 18 years old. And they thought I was going to go into cardiac arrest. So they sent me to St. Thomas. And I went to the ER, and my mom had to drive out. And
so 116 bottom number, that's the one that's supposed to be at 80, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they never did that psychodrama group again after that, because they realized that you cannot do that intensive therapy with people that are still detoxing.
Oh, gosh. Well, did you at least get to do it after you had detoxed?
I got to do the other therapy, yeah.
Gotcha.
But psychodrama just can be so intense because it's experiential and you're doing stuff with your family. I'd been there for like 4 or 5 days, I think it's like partially my fault. I'm not going to put it on them. I think I just like talked them into letting me go to the group, and then and then it just stirred up a lot of stuff, and then my biochemistry was all off, because I'm been drinking and using benzos for so long. And so I went to the hospital. I came back. I was very fortunate to have like 3 or 4 guys that were really into it. One of them had been through there before. And he was just telling me, man, this is it. Like, you've got to do the program. He's like, I know it feels like summer camp, and it feels like brainwashing, and it feels like you can't believe your life is like this, but you just have to do it. And so he got me in. His name's John Butts, and he's been around recovery. Yeah. So I was in treatment with him, and he was a sweetheart, man. I mean, he was great, and he was so funny and just so serious about recovery. So I got out. I went to sober living. To answer your question, did it take? No, I got kind of jolted by like, this is my life now, and it's all about recovery. And I'm supposed to be a college student. There weren't as many like young men's programs. So there's maybe like one other kid that was around my age. And I'm like, this can't be what my life is supposed to be. Like, if I go down this road of like, I'm an addict and my life is now meetings, there's no way I'm gonna do that, you know? And
can you dive into that a little bit? Because this is something that I think so many people, even today, where we've progressed with shattering somewhat the stigma of, you know, the doom of being the life of a recovering person, you know. I think it's always good to give a voice to that. You know, what were those things going through your head? Like, what, because I think it's cool to, you know, to name those and then talk about what the actual truth ended up being.
Yes. So for me, the tricky thing as a recovery community, as a culture that we're a part of, if we're in recovery, is that there is this request from the recovery community for conformity, right? There's a request to say, look at the similarities, not the differences. It's a we program. They even call it an NA terminal uniqueness, that there's nothing unique about the way that you used or drank that makes you different from other addicts. We all have and struggle from the same disease, if we want to call it that, of addiction. And I do believe that that's essential, because I've seen with addicts and alcoholics time and time again, the thing that talks them out of their recovery program is the mind is just so convincing. You know, it's like, I can just drink, or I had success that those couple months smoking weed. Like, and once you dip your toes in the water, the building comes tumbling down. You know what I mean? And so for me, kind of a long-winded answer, but for me, what I'm grateful for today is the reality of balancing that. Yes, we need to kind of not see ourselves as apart from the recovery community. We need to be invested in the recovery community, but there are many sub-communities within the recovery community. Yeah. And a lot of people don't stick around or really put the work in that needs to be done to form friendships or to find your tribe, your people that you connect with within the recovery community, because they're out there, but they may not be at the first 15 meetings you go to.
That's right.
You know, and you may just see someone and be like, oh, that's not my person. But if you see them 5 times or 10 times, if you're really invested to try to form relationships, you're going to find so many different people. I mean, look at all the movie stars and celebrities and musicians that have come out as being in recovery, and not just sober, but actively in recovery. Yeah. And they have fun. You know, we have fun. I've done awesome shit. I've been clean now for 16 years almost, and I've toured playing music. I've traveled through 11 different countries in Europe. I've, you know, gotten married, had a kid. I run a Buddhist meditation center. Like, all that stuff's wild. You know, I work for myself. I make pretty decent money. Like, I get to play golf. Like, that may sound lame to the younger me, but I live by 2 golf courses. You know, like, that shit's pretty cool. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, and there's a lot of possibility in recovery. I think we have come a long way in designing some of these kind of young adult programs, or like sober living houses that have young adults and things like that, because it's needed. It's just it is different to get clean when you're younger. Yeah.
Well, and, you know, not only that, when I was talking about today's culture, I think because there's been so much, you know, there's always more work to do. But I look at like Gen Z and you know, I hate saying the young people today, because I still like to consider myself young. But the people who are younger than you and me, you know, that are in college or mid or late 20s, whatever, you know, a lot of people party. But there's also this huge space that's been given to recognizing, acknowledging, and embracing mental health disorders and treatment for them, addiction and treatment for them, and the lifestyle that accompanies it. And so much more so than back when we got sober, you know. Not saying we had it so much worse, but, you know, it is like every generation is different. And, but no matter what, it really doesn't matter when you're coming off of addiction from drugs and alcohol. There's, no matter how accepting society is, there's always going to be fear of, you know, you're leaving this culture in life. You know, you and I were talking about all the things that you got with, you know, the addiction lifestyle: connection, freedom, escape, control, chaos, because it, you know, there's that need, right? So all those things you were getting, all of a sudden you had to leave behind.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge,
yeah.
You know, and there's got to be, there's so much fear in that. But we have to get to a place, where it hurts so bad that, that we're brave enough to step out on the unknown of people like you and me saying, hey, it's worth it. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not going to be some cheesy, whatever, live some cheesy life, you know, like there is a really positive, exciting, not lame life on the other side of this thing for you.
Yeah, and that's it. I think it's about, you know, I realize now in hindsight that a lot of what I was grasping onto out of fear was actually predicated on a delusion, which is that in order for me to be happy and have a normal life, I needed to not be an addict. And I thought that being an addict meant that I'm going to meetings, I'm sober, and therefore I can't do things that a normal life would entail. And it's a tricky delusion to break out of. And we have to realize that this delusion is reinforced in our society in a big way. You know, we look at like unwinding, we look at vacations being full of alcohol, we look at weddings being full of alcohol, we look at sporting events being full of alcohol. You know, we look at fun time, we look at fun equaling getting fucked up. And so, of course, I was grieving the loss of something. But what you can't see, and you can't give this to someone that's new in recovery, unfortunately, is that whole delusion that being normal and having fun, meaning using and drinking, completely goes away, and your life is so much better because of it. Because I share this with people that don't even need to be in recovery. You know, I tell them, like, hey, if you're up for it, stop drinking and using drugs, because it doesn't add anything to your life. It doesn't add anything to your life. I'm not judging people that drink and use drugs. You know, I use nicotine and I drink Red Bulls sometimes. There's tons of shit that I shouldn't do, you know, but with those things, my life isn't better because of it. My life isn't better because I use nicotine or better because I drink Red Bull. You know, they're all medicators, all of them. And we've got to just have the humility to say that these things, they don't add meaning to our life. They maybe help us to cope with life, and we don't have to judge them as good or bad. But in the grand scheme of things, I find that I am freer and happier when I'm less dependent on things to temporarily elevate my mood, give me energy, make me feel confident. And this is an aside from taking your prescribed mental health medication, your SSRIs or mood stabilizers, things like that. Totally different thing, because those aren't crutches. They help your brain work the right way, you know. But so anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But I really feel like this has truly been a gift of my recovery that I wanted to share, is that like there's a joy that comes from letting go of things that just are habits. And once we get in that groove of a habit, we just look for the next thing. Like when I'm going to get off work and I'm going to be able to eat that food or smoke that cigarette or do that thing, we're looking for the work break. We're always looking for the next thing. And we're not living in the moment, and we're not finding joy when we're so heavily medicated with whatever it is. And I'm not perfect. Like I'm probably a 65%, you know what I mean? And a big chunk of that comes from my recovery. But But I find that the more I just try to be present and stop living in this delusion that like one day I'm going to be happy when, or in this caught in being dependent on all these habits of medicating myself to make me feel better, I'm way more peaceful, way more happy. And,
Yeah.
it's a gift. It really is.
Absolutely. So I hear so much, and I want to get to this in a minute. I
Sure.
hear so much mindfulness rooted in what you're talking about right now. And I want to ask you real quick, though, if you could briefly go over what your experience was like leaving treatment. What did you do? Did you go to halfway house?
Yeah.
What was your aftercare plan like? Did you take suggestion? And lay that out for us.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it brief. So at the time, my attorney had said, if the treatment center suggests for you to do aftercare, do it. And if they require you to stay in Nashville, do it, because it will give us something to argue in front of the judge that you're on your way to rehabilitation, and therefore they shouldn't pull you out of it to go to prison. So sure enough, they suggested sober living in Nashville, and I did it. And I, like I said, was grieving, like you were talking about, like that whole identity, all those things that I got from addiction, because I got a lot out of it. I was grieving and I used, and the sober living house owner, Chip Healy, you may know Chip's place.
Yep.
He's since passed, but he let me come back. And then about a month later, I relapsed again. I went straight back to smoking crack. I spent all my money. I saw someone get shot in the motel parking lot that day. All these cops pulled up. I was high on coke. Unmanageable, like totally, instantly unmanageable. He came in my room at 7 a.m. I hadn't slept. I went back to the sober living house after I got high that night. And he said, Andrew, I love you. And because I love you and I believe in you and your recovery, you have to leave. Because if you don't have consequences, then you have no chance of getting better. And so he kicked me out, and it was true. And I had no one in Nashville that I knew other than people in recovery. And that's what it took for me. Is I feel like if there are any parents that listen to this, parents of addicts, enabling is going to kill your fucking kids. It is, and I called my mom up and I said, I just got kicked out. And she said, well, I'm in Florida, figure it out. And so I had nowhere to go. And I was literally either going to be homeless or reach out to someone in recovery and try to stay on their couch until I could get into sober living, because I couldn't get in that day. Right.
Yep.
And no one would take me because I just used. Every place needed you at that time to stay clean for 3 days before you could come in. Yeah. So that's what happened. And I stayed on my sponsor's couch, and he would let me come over every night around 9 when he got off work. And he'd kick me out in the morning when he was going to work. And he'd say, if you stay clean today, we'll talk about you staying here again. And I did that, I think, for a week. And we got into an Oxford house, which I was grateful for, but wasn't a great environment. But now I was serious about staying clean. And those relationships that I'd formed in recovery, even though I didn't use them in the moment that I wanted to use, they were still there for me when I was ready to get clean. And I leaned on them. I hung out with them. I'm telling you, the main thing that keeps people clean, in my opinion, is the fellowship. It doesn't matter if you believe in God or a higher power. Don't get hung up on that. I've been an atheist in recovery for, 14 of my 16 years. And the last 2, I now just call myself agnostic, because I feel like calling yourself an atheist is a little bit arrogant because you don't know what exists. But this is my perspective. But, the God thing, it's not that. The step work was really great, really helpful. But it's the sponsor, it's the home group, it's the people. You gotta be around the people, because they make life worth living. If you're just going to a meeting, it's gonna suck. Meetings kind of suck a little bit sometimes. It's like, I'm an addict and I'm here, it's like, you still go because you got to meet the people there. You got to talk to the people after the meeting and get their numbers. You got to surround yourself with other people that are in recovery, because then you have a crew of people to hang out with, or some buddies or some friends or whatever, that you can, help make life meaningful. And those relationships form slowly over time. But that was my experience, is I just kind of got in with those guys, and so much transpired over the next several years of recovery, but I stayed clean since March 11th, 2006.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So, tell me what your, what would you say that your biggest surprise was that you would have never guessed in, active addiction, that life brought you, like a positive surprise, that you would have just never guessed about your life, today?
Yeah.
The sobriety has given you.
That's so hard. I mean, it's such a cliche answer, but like my life is so much better. Like, this is kind of like a Buddhist type of perspective, so it's okay if it doesn't, but like the consciousness that I had when I was younger is not the same consciousness. Like, I'm literally not the same person I was when I was an addict.
Mm-hmm.
Like, everything about this mind, how it operates, has changed.
Yeah.
And I was so afraid that would happen when I got clean. And I'm so grateful that has happened now that I am where I am. And I can't describe what that is, but everything about myself has changed completely. I still love the music I loved, and it's not like your hobbies or preferences get different, but my sense of security, like literally how my mind functions, like I'm not anxious about the things I used to be anxious about. I'm not insecure about the things I used to be insecure about. I used to be so anxious. I didn't talk in a meeting for my first year clean. I maybe spoke once, and then I celebrated and literally had 4 home group members come up and say, I've never heard you speak. And now, if you know me today, you'd say, like, you can barely get me to shut up on this interview. You know what I mean? So, like, everything about me is different. And it's the greatest gift because, like I said, I still have the same preferences and hobbies, and those have grown and changed and things like that. But my anxiety, my depression, my insecurities, my fears, I just don't think like that anymore. The shame, the incredible amount of shame, like the fear of being vulnerable, like always having to people please, like performatively trying to be what I think you want me to be. I still struggle with some of that, but it's changed so much. And I would say that's the biggest gift that I've gotten from recovery, is just like security.
I love that. You mentioned something that's just like flipped a light switch for me. When I've told my story so many times, I used to talk about how, after I got on fire for recovery and I got some years into sobriety and was telling my story, I'd say, I went to a 12-step immersion program to get sober, and I was fortunate. It's what I needed. I had a brainwashing, and I feel like a brainwashing is almost what you have to have. But now I look back, I mean, this is also mad. Like, it's just words, right? But at the same time, I see people's eyes glaze over when you say brainwashing, and maybe that's not the best word, because when I hear you explain it, I'm going, it's like a brain evolution, because a brainwashing almost is like that. You think about that and it's like, okay, you're going to take and wash and wipe away everything that was there. And that's not necessarily what we're doing. We're taking new information to address the old ways of thinking and learning what isn't working for us, right? Like, we're not taking parts of ourselves away. We're learning the parts that no longer serve us.
That's right.
For the future. And I think that's basically what you said, but it just flipped this switch for me. That's just like, it was a really cool, I think it's a really cool way to look at it. Yeah. When it comes to that process of, what is, we internalize everything. Like you said, we spent so much time talking about this, the fear of getting sober, what it looks like and everything. And I don't know what addict doesn't internalize so much of what that will look like. I remember I talked about the forever concept for so long. I can't imagine forever not having a drug or alcohol at any given point. Not that I can deal with not doing it every day, all day, but the thought that I will never get to you, never have that escape again, never, that concept was way beyond for me.
Yeah.
But putting one foot in front of the other, right? Like working a program period and staying sober long enough gave my brain a chance to learn this new information and evolve. And like you said, it was through what supported me and kept me coming back was hearing people's stories, telling like what you're doing today, and that connection, the connection of people that kept, was almost my seatbelt half the time. Yeah. Of like keeping me in the boat.
Yeah.
So much so. Yeah. So you've been sober a while, and now you're doing so much good in behavioral health and helping out so many people that were in our shoes today in Nashville. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you do in therapy and also at Wildheart.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start with therapy because it's probably the shorter of the two. I got my undergraduate degree in music business and focused on production, on audio engineering, and what it takes to produce music. And so I did that for a while, but I also graduated during the height of the economic recession. So jobs in the music industry are already limited. And then during that time, the door was just closed. And so I was fortunate to be able to use my experience as a recovering addict to work at a treatment center part-time. And I recorded music all my free time. I wrote music, recorded music. I joined a group with a dear friend of mine who actually just recently passed due to an overdose this last Sunday, or not yesterday, but a week ago. Yeah. And, but he was clean then, you know what I mean? And we had a blast. Like we toured all over the Southeast and Northeast and did all of that. And then when it came time to, a lot of stuff kind of had happened in my life. A lot of trauma had surfaced at that point in my recovery, and I wasn't getting what I was needing just from 12-step program. And so I started to seek out other ways to help me to work through what was going on inside. And I found meditation community. And through that process, I'll talk about that here in a moment, the meditation community, I just had this kind of desire to what felt like a meaningful livelihood for myself was to help other people. And I asked myself, what's the degree that you can get that's basically a degree in helping people? And it's social work. So yeah, I went and got my master's and did that. I also started to facilitate groups on mindfulness meditation, which has been welcomed with open arms into the mental health community and even into the secular world, the business world. It's kind of like blown up in a lot of different areas. And so as that started to blow up, that comes from this ancient Buddhist tradition. That's where the practice originated from. But as it started being welcomed in the secular world, in the mental health world, I started to teach it. And so got my degree in social work, and I'm focusing on mindfulness and kind of like emotional psychology and emotional regulation and all the things that kind of come through mindfulness. And now I just recently actually just stopped my last facilitating group. I still facilitate at the meditation center here, but my last out treatment center group. And I'm trying to kind of keep things more simple at this point in my life because I have a daughter at home. But I'm now an individual therapist, and I focus on trauma, on complex kind of family dynamics, relationship issues, things like that. I'm trained in EMDR and brain spotting and somatic experiencing, and I kind of use those more experiential therapies and mindfulness together because I feel like, look, I've been a good talker and a good bullshitter most of my life. And for me, talk therapy is not the best route. I know it's great for a lot of people, but you really got to get in your body and pay attention to these emotions and sensations that are happening, that are getting activated in your relationships, to actually kind of do the work, to kind of connect the dots around, like, when did I learn this level of activation? And being able to process that can be really transformative. So that's what I do with individuals. I just have an office in the back of the meditation center in East Nashville, and I'm blessed, man. I mean, like, super privileged and grateful. You know what I mean? Like, everything is kind of just fit. And I did work myself in recovery for years, and then I did work on myself through meditation, and then I went and did my own therapy for 5 years and became a therapist, and it just kind of all makes sense and clicks. And so the other thing I'll say real quick is I did get really involved in meditation. I did it through a Buddhist community. You know, Buddhism is one of those things. It's like, you don't really have to be a Buddhist. It's not the point. You know, it's a contemplative practice. So it's not so much what you believe in, it's what you do. You know, are you being present? Are you being mindful? Are you opening yourself up and trying to be compassionate when there's pain in your life? You know, and that's something that we do. And so I learned some of those techniques and practices, and it's been life-changing. I've spent over 6 or 7 months of my life on silent meditation retreat. I've done months of silent retreat. So you don't have to get that into it. You know, 10, 15 minutes a day can be helpful for a lot of people, but it's been a big part of my life. And I'm currently the co-director and guiding teacher at Wildheart Meditation Center. We're open to the public. Anyone can come. You don't have to, any age, race, sexual identity, creed, religion, lack of religion, right? Like the program, you can have any background and check it out if you have an interest. And we're a nonprofit, so everything we do is just it's there so we can serve the community. And it's been a blessing. It's what I wanted my whole life, right? Is to be a part of a community and something that I can trust. And I feel like it's you know, it's been made available to me, and I'm so grateful for that.
Very cool. Awesome. So how can people connect, find out more information?
Sure. The best thing to do if you're interested in the meditation centers is not through me. I don't actually field all of those inquiries. You can email wildheartnashville@gmail.com, wildheartnashville@gmail.com. If you want to look up the website, it's wildheartmeditationcenter.org. So anything regarding that, that's where to go. If you want to reach out to me personally, just to, you know, talk to me or touch base with me about therapy or anything like that, it's NashvilleMindfulness@gmail.com.
Awesome.
And yeah, man, I really, really appreciate you asking me to do this. I always get fired up when I do this. And so thanks for your thoughtful questions.
Absolutely.
Like going to a meeting for me. I love it.
Same here. I tell you what, I don't know if it's the same way for everybody, but I mean it when I say when I first got sober for the longest period of time, hearing people's stories is what really anchored me and continually made me feel not only connected, but like I could keep doing this thing. I would always get these nuggets, you know, maybe I wouldn't hear everything from somebody's story, but I'd zone in and out. My attention span would, you know, wander off, but I'd always get some, you know, a few things from somebody's story. And every now and then, you know, you pay attention to the whole thing because it's just awesome. But, but anyway, I think sharing our stories is so important. And so I'm really excited every time I get to do this with, you know, with other people. And so thank you again. I really appreciate it. And
I love it. Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Well, to everybody listening or watching, we're so glad that you have joined us today. And like I always like to close out and say, it is never too late to start loving yourself, and you are only one decision away from a completely different life. Thanks, everybody.
For more information on today's episode, check out the show notes. Recovery Stories is brought to you by Promises Behavioral Health's Rooted alumni community. If you or a loved one are struggling, have questions, or ready to take the next step, call our admission center at 888-648-4098. Or visit us online at www.promisesbehavioralhealth.com. Our team is ready and waiting to answer the call for help. Whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please share with your friends. Follow, subscribe, and leave us a review. We are grateful for you and hope that you have been encouraged by today's episode. As always, remember you are only one decision away from a completely different life, and it is never too late to start loving yourself.